Hello and welcome to the 9th video of our research writing series. My name is Rahul Mitra. I'm an associate professor at Wayne State University. Let me share my screen. So sometime back, the 7th webinar of the series talked about how to toggle between theory, literature, and the research question. And once you actually start collecting data, however, you've got at least, you've got the data to contend with as well. And so the topic for today's webinar is basically number 9. How do we toggle between theory, literature, research question, and your data at the same time? The problem really is pretty much this. You are knee-deep in data analysis, but you are not quite sure how to apply the theory to your data. Isn't the research question enough? Is there something else that you should be doing over here? And of course, there is a disclaimer over here that what I'm about to share is probably best suited for qualitative research, although there might be lessons to draw from also if you are using quantitative methodologies as well. So first of all, it's usually helpful to figure out, what the different sections, the components of the paper really mean and their functions, right? So in this table, I've tried to sort of represent the functions and maybe an example also from a research paper about the theory section, the literature review section, the research question, and the data. So theory, as I understand it, and I explain and talk to my students about, is basically a framework or a lens, right? An eye lens to help you understand an issue. So for instance, suppose you want to understand how people are adjusting to a new workplace. In that case, organizational socialization theory would probably be the best theory, best suited to help understand, really what's happening in this situation, basically best suited to this particular problem. Your literature review can overlap sometimes with your theory section, but generally speaking, it's considered the previously published scholarly research that examines the issue you are interested in. So oftentimes, I find that the literature review is really important to help understand the context of study, right? So for example, in this case, the problem is how people are adjusting to a new workplace. And so the literature review would be looking at all of the prior research that has addressed this particular issue, this particular context in the past. Your research question draws from the theory and the literature review to address an important gap in the research, to propose an important solution for the underlying problem. So again, the way I explain it to my students is it is a specific question that you want to ask in your paper, right? So it's specifically based on what you are working on in your paper, not necessarily on all the other research gaps out there, but the specific issue that you are working on in your paper based on the theory and the review of the relevant literature. So continuing with this example, the research question might be what communication behaviors, since I'm a communication scholar, what communication behaviors help people adjust to a new job during the COVID-19 pandemic? So suppose, during your literature review and your theory, you found that, there's a little bit of a gap when it comes to the kind of adjustments people make to workplaces. And there's really not much in terms of how people adjust to workplaces post, large social crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. And so doing the research on this particular research question becomes, particularly salient, perhaps. So then imagine that, based on this theory, literature review, and the research question, you have access to a lot of data. And your data in that case is basically the raw material or observations that can help you understand the question. And of course, it can run the gamut from interview data to social media posts to survey data to other forms of data as well. So once we have a good understanding of what these different components and sections really mean and what their goals really are, let's try to toggle and try to influence the different ways. Let's try to trace the different ways that these components can influence each other. I use the word toggling because to me it signifies multi-directional influences. And this is really, honestly, the messy way that research actually operates in practice. So theories are going to affect the research question as will the literature review. But as you are, going into the data, you're going to find that what your initial findings, your preliminary findings from your data are probably also going to encourage you to go back to both the theory and the literature review and potentially even revise the research question and or hypotheses if you have them in order to move the project forward. And so you find that rather than a very sort of linear movement, right, where theory leads to literature, leads to research question, leads to data, I find, at least in the kind of research I do, which admittedly is more qualitative, that the practice of research really involves being open to these multi-directional influences when it comes to research. So let's look at an example, right, about how to toggle theory, literature, and research question. So in the example paper that we've been talking about how people adjust to the workplace after COVID-19, you would start with a literature review about how people adjust to a new workplace. This explains the context. As you are looking at this prior literature, chances are you would end up zeroing in an organizational socialization theory, which is really profound and well suited for this adjustment process. As you are going through the theory and the literature review, you're probably going to identify a gap in the research. And that is that, there's a gap in terms of how people adjust during uncertain or risky times. That in turn will push you to go back, right, to the literature to figure out how people do adjust to uncertain and risky times. And that actually might, in fact, push you towards risk communication theories. And so that in turn might then, show you, again, a perceived gap that, well, we know a little bit about how people adjust to risk in general, but perhaps the risks posed by the COVID-19 pandemic in the specific context of the workplace are not quite well documented, right? And so combining your understanding of the research gaps across theory and literature review, you really come to this, again, this toggled process. Through this toggled process, you come to this research question, which is what communication behaviors can help people adjust to a new job during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And so to represent this toggling process on a clean paper, generally, it actually ends up looking like a linear process, although the actual process, like we just saw, tends to be more messy. But in general, when you represent it in paper format, you do have to, adhere to convention, and you have these sections of theory, literature review, and then your research question. And then within these sections, you would discuss first under the theory section, you would talk about organizational socialization theory and what it contributes to your study. You would talk about risk communication theories and what they contribute. Suppose, just again, using an example, maybe you zero in on one particular theory of risk communication, say the social construction of risk theory over here. And then your next section, you talk about your review of the literature, right? Explaining the context and how you understand, prior research on this issue. And so you probably begin this literature review section talking about how people adjust to new jobs amidst uncertain or risky situations. And then from there, zero in on the specific risks encountered by people during the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, you would end this part of the paper by articulating your research question, which is what communication behaviors help people adjust to a new job during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the two sides of the slide are basically the same. On the left-hand side, I think this represents the sort of, even though you've got this, downward linear movement, you can see how you sort of toggling back and forth across theory and literature before you come to a definitive research question, right? So on the left-hand side, you've definitely got a lot more sort of movement and toggling, those multi-directional influences that I was talking to you about. And this is the process of research. But as far as the output of research is concerned, and this sort of represents the process on the left-hand side, it's generally expected to be much more linear and clean. So now, what does this look like when we bring in the data? So suppose we begin with our research question that we already have, right? What communication behaviors help people adjust to a new job during the COVID-19 pandemic? That was our beginning research question. And suppose you analyze the data using a specific method, suppose it's thematic analysis, to generate initial or primary codes, depending on the particular method of thematic analysis you've chosen. You then sort your codes accordingly, right, into primary and secondary codes on the basis of either logical arrangement and or theory. So theory does become important over here when it comes to sorting your initial or primary codes. You would consider, for example, how the codes might fit with the theories and the literature that you're drawing from. Do they fit really neatly into the categories that your theory suggests? Or do they suggest new possibilities? Or do they entirely challenge those theories that you had before? So this is really important to realize that the role of theory is not after you've already, sort of written out your, come up with your codes and you're writing up your paper. The role of theory is involved even as you are, following the method of analysis and sorting the codes that you actually come up with, from your thematic analysis method. So you will then re-examine the literature and the theory then, and sort of you'll go back to the literature and theory to verify whether your data does in fact suggest new possibilities or modifications. You would then consider how the codes fit with the research question. Do they help you answer the research question? Sometimes they will. And if they do, you want to arrange your codes in your findings section or your results section accordingly. I always ask my students to arrange the results and findings section in the arrangement of the research questions. If they have a particular research question or two research questions, then the finding sections should be arranged according to research question 1, research question 2, and within the research questions, the different subsections or parts of the research question. Sometimes it is important to re-examine the research question to see whether it fits the data, to see whether it fits the emerging storyline. And this is usually the part where sometimes you might realize that some changes or tweaks to the research question are warranted, right? So again, we're talking about this toggling or multi-directional influence. And you start seeing how, yes, the theory, the research question, and the literature are going to influence the data. But as you're analyzing the data itself can push you to find new research, new literature, to suggest changes to the theory, and to even potentially suggest changes to the research question. Finally, again, you want to arrange the analysis section, like I said before, to answer the research question and or to highlight relevant concepts from the theory and the literature review. So basically, we're sort of adding one more panel over here to our previous diagram, where you, in your finding section, you want to divide your finding section into subsections with subheadings that are really addressing the answers to the research questions that you've asked before. So what are some major takeaways? I use the images in the slides really mindfully, and I want to really highlight the winding nature of the stream or river, whatever you want to call it, because I think it really does reflect the actual messy process of research. Although the final product, the research paper, is supposed to be, very linear and very coherent, I think we have to acknowledge that the process of research itself is oftentimes messy and multi-directional. But as you are writing this paper out, your job is to make this research process, as messy as it is, coherent for your audience, for other academics and other readers who might be interested in reading your paper. And so it is important that, despite this messy, winding nature of the actual research process, the stream, your job is to sort of help bridge, I take the metaphor maybe a little too far, but to help sort of bridge this process, for your readers, so that this messy process starts making a lot more sense. So a key takeaway is that toggling across theory, literature review, research question, and your data will allow you to identify the research gap and or the practical contributions of your paper. Toggling might actually often result in combining literature's theory and data to help generate a new and impactful research question. In cases where the old RQ, which was primarily based on prior research and theory, you might find that your new data is exciting and describes a new issue that prior research is simply inadequate to address. And so, you might actually create a revised research question in many ways. Finally, again, just to highlight, emphasize the whole metaphor of the image on the right-hand side. Toggling and the actual research process is messy. It is a far cry from the streamlined finished product. However, once the toggling is done, it is time to rearrange everything to showcase a so-called logical flow, so that that includes theory, literature, research question, the method section, of course, and the findings. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in, and best of luck on your paper.